जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरदारी। जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरदारी। यशोदानंदन व्रजजन रंजन, यशोदानंदन व्रजजन रंजन, यमुना तीरा वनचारी, यमुना तीरा वनचारी। जय राधा माधव कुंज विहारी। जय राधा माधव कुंज विहारी। जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरदारी। जय गोपीचन वल्लभा गिरिवरदारी। यशोदानंदन व्रजजन रंजन, यशोदानंदन व्रजजन रंजन, यमुना तीरा वनचारी, यमुना तीरा वनचारी। जय राधा माधव कुंज विहारी। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम राम हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम राम हरे हरे। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम राम हरे हरे। जय प्रभुपादा जय प्रभुपादा, जय प्रभुपादा श्रील प्रभुपादा। जय प्रभुपादा जय प्रभुपादा, जय प्रभुपादा श्रील प्रभुपादा। एवं कृष्णपाद परमहंस परिव्याख्यात सूत्र सदा श्री श्रीमती श्री भक्तिवेदांत स्वामी श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय। इस्कॉन संस्थापक श्रील प्रभुपाद की जय। एवं कृष्णपाद परमहंस परिव्याख्यात सूत्र सदा श्री श्रीमती भक्ति सिद्धांत सरस्वती गोस्वामी महाराज प्रभुपाद की जय। एवं कृष्णपाद श्रीलपुर की शोधा महाराज की जय। एवं कृष्णपाद वैष्णव सार्वभौम जगन्नाथ दास महाराज की जय। जय श्री रूप सनातन भट्ट रघुनाथ श्री जीव गोपाल भट्टदास गोस्वामी प्रभु की जय। नमाचार्य दास ठाकुर की जय। प्रेम से को श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद की जय। श्री श्री राधा कृष्ण गोपिका श्याम कुंड राधा कुंड गिरिवर्धन की जय। श्री गौरांगी बेंगलोरेश्वर भगवान की जय। श्री मायापुर धाम की जय। श्री वृंदावन धाम की जय। गंगामयी की जय। मुरमयी की जय। भक्ति देव की जय। तुलसी देवी की जय। अनंत कोटि वैष्णव की जय। श्री हरनाम संकीर्तन की जय। ग्रंथ श्रीमद भागवतम की जय। इस्कॉन वर्तमान गुरुवंद की जय। समावेद भक्तवंद की जय। गौरव प्रेमानंद जय। Very well. All glories to the assembly. All glories to the assembly. All glories to the assembly. All glories to Shri Guru and Shri Gauranga. All glories to Shri Prabhupada ki jai. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam. Devim Saraswati Vyasam Tato Jayamudire. Nashtaprayeshva Patreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya. Bhagavati Uttama Sloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtihi. Hare Krishna. Welcome now to the Srimad Bhagavatam class. Today we are reading from Canto 3, Chapter 31, Text 14. Yappancha Bhuta Rachite Rahita Sharire Dhanno Yatendriya Gunartha Chidatmakoham Tena Vikunda Mahimanam Rishim Tamem Enam Vande Param Prakriti Purushayo Pumamsam Yappancha Rachite Rahita Sharire Channo Yatendriya Gunartha Chidatmakoham Tena Vikunda Mahimanam Rishim Tamenam Vande Param Prakriti Purushayo Pumamsam Yappancha Rachite Rahita Sharire Channo Yatendriya Gunartha Chidatmakoham Tena Vikunda Mahimanam Rishim Tamenam Vande Param Prakriti Purushayo Pumamsam. I am separated from the Supreme Lord because of my being in this material body, which is made of 5 elements, and therefore my qualities and senses are being misused, although I am essentially spiritual. Because the Supreme Personality of Godhead is transcendental to material nature and the living entities, because he is devoid of such a material body, and because he is always glorious in his spiritual qualities, I offer my obeisances unto him. The difference between the living entity and the Supreme Personality of Godhead is that the living entity is prone to be subjected to material nature, whereas the Supreme Godhead is always transcendental to material nature, as well as to the living entity. When the living entity is put into material nature, then his senses and qualities are polluted or designated. There is no possibility for the Supreme Lord to become embodied by material qualities or material senses, for he is above the influence of material nature and cannot possibly be put in the darkness of ignorance like the living entities. Because of his full knowledge, he is never subjected to the influence of material nature. Material nature is always under his control, and it is therefore not possible that material nature can control the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Since the identity of the living entity is very minute, he is prone to be subjected to material nature. But when he is freed from this material body, which is false, he attains the same spiritual nature as the Supreme Lord. At that time, there is no qualitative difference between him and the Supreme Lord. But because he is not so quantitatively powerful as to never be put under the influence of material nature, he is quantitatively different from the Lord. The entire process of devotional service is to purify oneself of this contamination of material nature and put oneself on the spiritual platform where he is qualitatively one with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In the Vedas, it is said that the living entity is always free. Asamgo hi ayam purusha. The living entity is liberated. His material contamination is temporary and his actual position that he is liberated. This liberation is achieved by Krishna consciousness, which begins on the point of surrender. Therefore, it is said here, I offer my respectful obeisances unto the Supreme Person. Om Gyanti Mirandas, Jnananjay Salakya, Chakshuran Mantamena, Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha, Sri Chaitanya Manopishtam, Stapitam, Ena Bhutale, Swayam Rupkadamakyam, Tadati Swapadantikam, Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Padakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sakarjatam Sagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Saitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padam Sagana Lalila Sri Vishakanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinapando Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Taptaganchana Gaurangi Radhe Vindhamani Shubhanaste Devi Padmami Haripriye Panchakalpatarupyascha Kapasnirupye Evacha Pachitanam Bhavnebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Moham Karo Devacharam Ungam Lange Devi Kapadamaham Mande Shivram Devatarnam Paramantamadam Shri Chaitanya Ishwaram Hare Krishna. So here you see here how the human soul further prays. I'm separated from the Supreme Lord because of my being in this material body, which is made up of 5 elements. Therefore, my qualities and senses are being misused, although I'm essentially spiritual. So, originally, if you look at, we are spiritual by nature. We have also a spiritual body like that, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Lord is spiritual, that is, his body is not made up of the material elements like ours. It is a spiritual, that is Satchit Ananda, eternity, blissful and full of knowledge. And we, the living entity, that is the soul within our body, that is also spiritual in nature, consisting of eternity, bliss, and knowledge. But what happens is that when we also want to become God, then the Lord makes arrangements for us to be put in this material world, and we become separated from the Supreme Lord. When we become separated, then we get what is called this material body, which is made up of 5 gross elements and 3 subtle elements. The 5 gross elements are earth, water, fire, air, ether, and the subtle elements are mind, intelligence, and false ego. Because we wanted to become God and we wanted to lord over. So when one accepts a material body, then the qualities or the senses that are there originally within us are being misused, although they are essentially spiritual. So in the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a mention of how the 5 senses, sense objects, the sense organs, the 5 knowledge acquiring senses, and mind, they're all 16 material expansions. And all these combined with the living entity are influenced by the 3 modes of material nature, and one becomes conditioned in this material world. The Lord himself says in Bhagavad Gita, Mamai Vamsa Jiva Loke Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. That means the living entities are eternal fragmental parts, but they become conditioned when they come to this material world, and they struggle very hard with the 6 senses, which include the mind. So when the living entity comes in contact with these material elements, he becomes influenced by the 3 modes of material, that is goodness, passion, and ignorance. Then the subtle and gross bodies develop, and the ingredients like earth, water, fire, and so on. So, but the Supreme Lord is transcendental to the material nature, and the living entities who are devoid of, who are actually also transcendental in nature, become devoid of the spiritual qualities when they take up a material body. In the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, Lord Shiva glorifies the Supreme Lord as to how the Lord is transcendental by nature. He says, my dear Lord, you have manifold energies, and these energies are manifested in manifold forms. The Lord has got multiple energies, and the Lord manifests these energies in multiple forms. Then he says, you have also created this cosmic manifestation, and although you maintain it as if it were permanent, you ultimately annihilate it. So the Lord creates this material world, maintains it, and in a way that everyone thinks that it is permanent, but ultimately it is also subject to annihilation. And then he further says You are never disturbed by such changes and alterations, but the living entities are disturbed by them, and therefore they find the cosmic manifestation to be different or separated from you. But you are always independent. I can clearly see this. So, a lot of changes take place in the process of creation, maintenance, and annihilation. The Lord does not get disturbed by these material changes because He is now subject to the three modes of material nature. But we, the living entities, being minute part and parcels, that means the soul within our body is a very small part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. So it is easy, very easy for this soul to become subjected to this material nature uh, when it is kept in brought into this material world. So at that time, we think that this cosmic manifestation is different or separated from the Lord. The Lord is always independent. Mainly, the Lord has got three energies, that is internal, external, and marginal. And the spiritual, the whole manifestation is created into two, that is spiritual world and material world. Now, in the spiritual world, the living entities are all eternally liberated, which is the eternal position of the soul. But because they never come in contact with the material energy, but when they come to this material world, they become what is called being conditioned, and they are separated from the Supreme Lord. And due to their contact with the material energy, their existence is also very, very troublesome. They're always struggling. And when the living entity is put into a situation where he feels independent of the Supreme Lord, and he wants to enjoy this material world independently. In the process of imitating the Supreme Lord, he is brought into a false notion that he is the enjoyer. Actually, the Lord is Purusha. Purusha means the supreme enjoyer, and we are to be enjoyed by the Supreme Lord. But when we become separated and we have an independent thought, we want to become enjoyer of this material world. So therefore, the spiritual energy, the living entity, is put into a troublesome situation which is not his constitutional position. Just like a fish, when it is put out of water, the fish struggles. So similarly, when the living entity is put into this material world, which is not his constitutional position, the living entity struggles very, very hard. That means that actually the material energy is not our original place for the living entity. But due to the idea of becoming falsely independent, we struggle in this material energy. So the Lord is glorifying the living entity, actually glorifying the Lord in his spiritual qualities. What are the spiritual qualities that are mentioned here? The Supreme Personality of Godhead is transcendental to the material nature and also the living entities. That means the difference between the living entities like us and the Supreme Personality of Godhead is that the living entity is prone to be subjected to material nature, whereas Supreme Godhead is always transcendental to the material nature as well as to the living entities. When we are put into this material nature, then the senses and qualities are polluted or designated. That means we originally have the senses which are spiritual in nature, but when we are put into this material world or material nature, these senses become polluted. But there is no possibility of the Supreme Lord to become embodied by these material qualities of senses because it's transcendental. And Lord cannot be put into the darkness of ignorance like the living entities like us. Then the next quality that is mentioned is that because the Lord is full knowledge. Now I mentioned Satchit Ananda, eternity, bliss, and full of knowledge. We are also full of knowledge as the Atma, but it is covered. But it is also limited to the size. There is a qualitative difference between the soul and the super soul. But because the Lord is never put into this, influenced by the material nature, he is actually The material nature is under his control. The Lord is not under the control of the material nature, but the material nature is under his control. Therefore, there is no way that the material energy can control the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Like the living entities are being controlled by the three modes. The Lord is not controlled. Because the reason is that the identity of the living entity is very, very minute. Therefore, he is prone to be subjected to this material nature. But when he is freed from this material body, which is false, actually the material body is not real, it is false. In a way, it is real, but actually it is not our original position. Then the living entity attains this original supreme spiritual nature as good as the Supreme Lord. But still, at that time, there is no qualitative difference, but he is not quantitatively as powerful as the Lord himself. So even when one becomes liberated from these material conditions, the living entities are qualitatively one with the Lord. But this concept, very many actually try to misconcept or misunderstand, saying that we become Lord. And in fact, there's a tendency for us to think that we can also become Lord. And in the process of thinking like that, Lord puts us into this material nature. Why? Because quantitatively we are not powerful to be as the Lord. So therefore we are put into this material nature. We are put under the influence of this material nature. In the fourth canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, there is a very nice quote which says, the Lord says, "My dear friend, I, the super soul, and you, the individual soul, are not different in quality. For we both are spiritual." That means the soul and the super soul, both are spiritual in nature. In fact, he says, "My dear friend, you are qualitatively not different from me in your constitutional position." That means the quality of both the soul and the super soul is the same by our constitutional position. But those who are actually advanced scholars who are in knowledge do not find any qualitative difference between them. That means those who are fully in knowledge, they have an understanding that there is no difference between God and us in terms of quality. But in terms of quantity, there is a very big difference because we are Anu. Anu means very minute, and the Lord is Vibhu, that is very great. The point is that both the Lord and the living entity, there is no difference in the two in terms of qualitative. They qualitatively, there is one. Then there is a further mention that as a person sees the reflection of his body in a mirror to be one with himself and not different, whereas others actually see two bodies. So in our material condition, in which the living entity is affected and not affected, there is a difference between God and the living entity. That means when we see our reflection in a mirror, in one sense, it is the same, but still the reflection is a reflection, it is not original. So similarly, there is a difference between the Lord and the living entities like us. The difference is that we are being a minute part and parcel. This living entity like us are a small reflection of the original Lord himself. So we are originally spiritual in nature. And the purpose, there is another example given in that when a sun is reflected in a pot of water, the sun knows that there is no difference between himself and the reflection in the water. That means we normally see a reflection of sun in the water. Actually, there is no difference in terms of reflection, but still there is a difference because those who are in darkness, they perceive that there are many, many small suns in each and every pot. So if you put 10 pots and there are 10 reflections, one in real knowledge understands that there is only one sun, but the reflection in all the 10 are one who is lacking in knowledge, he thinks there are many suns. Why? Because the reflections are very, very small, whereas the original sun is very, very large. So Vaishnava philosophers conclude that the living entity is simply a small sample of the original personality of Godhead. So we are actually a very, very small sample of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Lord is full, not only full, He is powerful and He is opulent also. But a self-realized soul, that means one who really understands the truth, he knows that he and the Supreme Lord can never become one. Although he and the Supreme Person are one in quality, the living entity is prone to forget his spiritual identity. So, because we want to become God, the Lord gives a momentary situation. It is like it is also mentioned in this purport that eternally we are not conditioned. When we say our original constitutional position is not conditioned, our constitutional position is to be liberated from this material condition. But we are put into this material world to realize that this is not a place for us to become God or to be our enjoyer. There is only one enjoyer, that is the Supreme Lord only. That is why it's called Purusha. But when a conditioned soul is put into this material world, he forgets his real identity. Therefore, when he sees himself to be conditioned, he identifies himself with his material body. So, originally, when we are in the spiritual world, we identify ourselves as the spiritual substance that is called the Atma, the soul. But when we are put into this material world, we identify ourselves with this material body. I, mine, everything that is there belongs to me or mine, my family, my country, my society, and so forth. But for the Lord, there is no difference between his body and soul. We have a material body which is different from the soul. But for the Lord, there is no material body. His body and soul are the same because they are all spiritual in nature. And although the Lord is present as the Paramatma in our material body, the Lord does not have a material body like us. The super soul is devoid of any designation, whereas the conditioned soul identifies himself with this particular type of body. So when we are put into this material world, our consciousness becomes contaminated, our senses become contaminated, and we identify ourselves with the body and the senses. Then further, the Lord says, in this way, both swans live together in the heart. When one swan is instructed by the other, he is situated in his constitutional position. So here, the living entity is compared to a swan, and the Lord is also compared to a swan. So when one swan is instructed by the other, that is when the soul is instructed by the super soul, then that is the original constitutional position. He retains, he regains his original Krishna consciousness, which was lost due to identification with material attraction. It is mentioned here as to why they are compared to swans, because the individual soul and the super soul, they are originally compared to swan because swans are white or uncontaminated. That means in our original constitutional position, the soul is uncontaminated, and they are just like swans because swan is white in color. So similarly, the soul is in its uncontaminated position is very, very clean and clear. So when the inferior swan is separated from the other swan, is attracted to material enjoyment. So when we become separated from the material, from the Supreme Lord, then we become contaminated. We are attracted to material enjoyment because the tendency to be attracted is already there. So either we have to be attracted to the Supreme Lord or we have to be attracted to the material nature. And this is the reason for the fall down. But when he again hears the instructions of the other swan, bigger swan, he understands his real position and is again revived to original consciousness. So when we take to the instructions of the Lord as mentioned in the scriptures, then we again become original in our consciousness, that is our original Krishna consciousness. This is process what is called uh, self-realization. There is also another quote in the Srimad Bhagavatam 4th canto, where there is a mention when Prithu Maharaj was actually performing sacrifice. Prithu Maharaj was a great devotee of the Lord, and he was performing sacrificial oblations. That is, when the Lord becomes pleased by the offering of oblations, the Lord himself actually appears in the sacrificial arena. So when Prithu Maharaj was performing his sacrifices, the Lord Vishnu himself appeared, and uh, he told Prithu Maharaj, he says that anyone who knows that this material body made up of 5 gross elements, the sense organs, the working senses and the mind, is simply supervised by the fixed soul, is eligible to be liberated from material bondage. In essence, the actual meaning of this purport is that, of this translation is that anyone who understands that this whole material body is consisting of the 5 gross elements, the subtle elements, the sense organs, etc. But it is supervised by the fixed soul. The soul is fixed and the soul is observing all these things. Such a person becomes liberated from this material bondage. Why? Because he becomes free from the concept of material body. He is fixed on the soul within and not the body. So this is how one becomes liberated from this material bondage. So the first point that one should know is that the soul is different from the body. The soul is the ultimate. The soul is called Dehe, or one who possesses the body, and the material body is called Deha, or the embodiment of the soul. That means the material body is the embodiment of the soul. The body keeps on changing at every moment. At every moment we see our body, at every second, in fact, the body keeps changing. But the soul is fixed. The soul does not have any changes like we see the material body, which is explained in the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So this change of body that is there is due to the reactions of the 3 modes of material nature. And one who has understood this fixed position of the soul will never become disturbed by the actions and interactions of modes of material nature in the form of happiness and distress. So what happens is that when the 3 modes of material nature interact, one is it brings a lot of changes in the material body, and it brings forth interactions in the form of happiness and distress. But one who is fixed on the spiritual platform, who knows that this soul is spiritual in nature, does not become disturbed by the so-called happiness and distress, because it is not the real. The soul is transcendent to both the happiness and distress. But because we identify ourselves with the material body, we become disturbed by these external moments. And further, it said that one should try to tolerate these external moments in material nature. So whether one is when one is in happiness, one should not be so excited, and when one is in distress, he should not be disturbed by that. One should be tolerant. This is what the teachings in Bhagavad Gita also say, that one should become transcendental to the material happiness and distress, because they are temporary in nature. The real happiness is the spiritual happiness, which is eternal and permanent. And further, there is a mention that the conclusion is that the living entity should always be indifferent to the action and reaction of the external body. So whatever actions and reactions take place due to the external body, the soul should always be indifferent. We should be not react to these situations. The Lord also says that this body is made of gross elements like earth, water, fire, air, ether, etc., is completely different from the soul. The soul does not have any of these material constitutes. Therefore, one should not be disturbed by the actions and reactions of these gross and subtle elements. And the practical process to attain this stage of difference is to execute devotional service. And only one who engages himself in devotional service 24 hours a day can be indifferent to the actions and reactions of the external body. That means one who is not engaging in devotional service becomes subjected to the actions and interactions of this material body. But one who executes devotional service, because the soul is spiritual in nature and is connected to the supreme soul or super soul through devotional service, and that is executed through the material body. When a man is absorbed in that particular thought, he does not hear or see any external activities, even though they are enacted in his presence. That means so many material activities might take place in our presence, but we become indifferent to these because we are not this material body. Whereas the soul, which is spiritual in nature, experiences the bliss that is there originally there by devotional service. The soul is eternal, the Supreme Lord is eternal, And the process of connection of both of them is devotional service, which is also eternal. So those who are fully absorbed in this devotional service do not care what is there in the external body. And that particular status is called samadhi. And one who has attained that stage of samadhi is what is called a first class yogi. That means the Lord Himself says in Bhagavad Gita, Yoginam api sarvesham atkirantanentaratmana. That means the topmost yogi is one who is always fixed in devotional service of the Lord. What happens is that when one performs devotional service all the time, then he becomes he identifies himself as a spirit soul and not the material body, and he is always situated in the platform of samadhi. In that state of samadhi, one is not disturbed by the material circumstances. Further, in the fourth canto, Prithu Maharaj, he advises his citizens. He is a great devotee and great king also. He advised the citizens, he says, engaging your minds, your words, your bodies, and the results of your occupational duties, and being always open-minded, you should always render transcendental devotional service to the Lord. According to your abilities and occupations in which you are situated, you should engage your service at the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead with full confidence and without reservation. That means, I'll read the sentence again. According to your abilities and occupation, that means everyone has a different ability and everyone is occupied differently. But according to one's abilities and occupation, one should engage his service unto the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead with full confidence and without reservation. That means we should engage in devotional service with full confidence. Yes, this is my original constitution position, and one should not have any reservations in this. Why we have reservations? Because we are still fixed on our material body. Then Pudumara says that then you will surely be successful in achieving the final objective in your lives. That means we all have an objective in life, and that is to go back to Godhead and be situated in our original spiritual situation. So by performing devotional service constantly and serving the Lord with full faith and confidence without any reservation, one achieves the final result or the purpose of one's life. So the Lord also made classifications for the living entities to observe this. For example, he classified as Chaturvarnam, Maya system, Maya Guna Karma Vibhagasya. The Lord made classifications in terms of their orders, like Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Sudras. But then there is no difference of the soul in a Brahmana or a Kshatriya or a Vaishya or a Sudra. They are situated or classified in terms of execution of a duty. The reason this mention is that in the purport that a Brahmana should also execute his duties, a Kshatriya should also execute his duties. The duties are different for a Brahmana or a Kshatriya or a Vaishya or a Sudra. The Brahmanas are supposed to be yajanyas and pardon. Is supposed to perform yajnas, cultivate spiritual knowledge and give this knowledge to others, accept charity and distribute charity. Similarly, a Kshatriya is meant to protect the society from harm, not only the human beings, but also other animals and every living entity. A Vaishya is meant to protect cows and also farming and engage in business. And a Shudra is meant to serve the other classes, that is Brahmana, Kshatriya, and Vaishya. So the Lord has facilitated this Varnashrama system by which if one executes his duties, his occupational duty in each, whatever is he's situated in, till he will attain a platform of devotional service when he does that as a service to the Lord. The point is that we all have our occupational duty, but when we do this as a service to the Lord, then we also attain that position. Not that one has to sit in a forest or one has to leave home and go to a forest and live alone and practice yoga. No, that is not the correct conception. The point is that even though everyone, the husband maybe have to go out to work. Nowadays, of course, women also work, but a woman at a household can also perform her duty to the Supreme Lord by executing this as a service to the Lord. So that is why it is mentioned, according to one's ability and quality, one should execute his occupational duty. That is sufficient enough. One does not have to become someone like Lord Brahma or Lord Shiva or Indra or Lord Chaitanya or even Acharyas like Ramanujacharya, whose capabilities are far, far higher. But it is mentioned that even a Shudra, who is in the lower category of life, also can achieve the same success. That means devotional service is the original constitutional position of all living entities, and everyone can attain that quality. And anyone can become successful in devotional service provided he displays no duplicity. That is, there's no duplicity in devotional service, which one must understand. One must be very frank and very, very open minded. So, to be situated in a lower status of life is not a disqualification for success in spiritual life. That means if one feels that he is in a lower platform of category of living being, one should not be discouraged by that, because qualification for devotional service is not a Brahmana or Kshatriya, but is the living entity within us. The soul is the same. Therefore, everyone is equally having an opportunity to perform devotional service. Then, by performing his particular occupational duty under the guidance of a proper spiritual master, he can achieve the highest success of life. So when one performs one's occupational duty, irrespective of whatever varna and asrama he is situated in, under the guidance of a proper spiritual master, that is a bona fide spiritual master, who can guide the disciple, then one can achieve the highest success in life. Then there is also mention of in the fourth canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the real interest of a living entity is to get out of these nescience that causes him to endure repeated birth and death. So the real living entity's interest is that to somehow get out of this nescience or ignorance, which is subject to repeated birth and death. That is, get out of this material world. And further says that the only remedy is to surrender unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead through his representative. So unless one renders devotional service unto the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Vasudeva, one cannot become completely detached from this material world. Nor can he possibly manifest real knowledge. That means we have knowledge, but which is covered due to our external covering of the material body. So unless and until one becomes situated in devotional service, one cannot become free from this covered knowledge. One cannot manifest the real knowledge of the spirit soul. So also there is a mention, actually, how when we were talking about Puthu Maharaj, they and his wife Queen Anchi, both were great devotees of the Lord. They were king and queen, and they perfected their life by performing devotional service. That's to teach an example to the living entities like us. So when they were going back to the spiritual world, there were Vaikuntha airplanes which came to pick them up. And then there's a quote in this which says that in this material world, every human being has a short span of life. And those who are engaged in devotional service go back home, back to Godhead, for they are actually on the path of liberation. For such persons, there is nothing that is not available. That means we have a very short span of life, but if we perform devotional service, then one can be easily situated on the path of liberation. What is that liberation? The liberation is to become free from this material body. So even by performing devotional service in this material body, in this material world, one can become liberated. And that liberation state can be achieved when one engages in devotional service and situates himself in pure spiritual status and becomes free from external material circumstances and becomes free from happiness and distress. And this liberation is achieved by Krishna consciousness, which begins from the point of surrender. Therefore, it is said that here the soul prays that I offer my respectful obeisances unto that Supreme Personality of Godhead. That means the soul is offering respectful obeisances to the Supreme Lord who has got all these qualities. Similarly, there's a quote the Lord tells Arjuna in Bhagavad Gita 6:27. Says Prashanta Manasa Hienam Yoginam Api Sukam Uttamam Upaisti Shanta Rajasam Brahma Bhutam Akalmasham. The translation is The yogi whose mind is fixed on me verily attains the highest perfection of transcendental happiness. That means when a devotee is fixed on the uh, Supreme Lord, he attains perfect transcendental happiness. Then he says he is beyond the mode of passion and he realizes qualitative identity with the Supreme, and thus he is free from all reactions to past states. That means when one performs devotional service, he becomes free from the three modes of material nature and he realizes his spiritual qualitative identity with the Supreme Lord and becomes free from all reactions to the past deeds. That is called the Brahmabhuta platform. That's why it is said Brahmabhuta Prasannatma Sochati Nakangshati. That means one is situated in the Brahmabhuta platform, that is situated on at that time, he is free from all hankering and lamentation. We all are there, always hankering something, and that hankering is something that it doesn't stop. It is more of a material hankering when in the form of desires. We have one desire, when it is fulfilled, we have another desire. So we always hanker. And what happens when we hanker? The Lord facilitates also by fulfilling our hankering. But we lose them at some point of time. We may hanker after a lot of money, but then that money also does not stay in one's life eternally. That's why Lakshmi is called Chanchala. Lakshmi is always situated wherever the Lord, on the chest of the Lord. That means wherever the Lord is there, Lakshmi also is with him. So those who are devotees of the Lord are not bereft of the opulences, but Lakshmi always stays and does not move from such a place. So when we lose that Lakshmi, what happens is that we lament. So one should become free from this anchoring and lamentation. In the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, there is a very nice quote which says, Iha yasya harer dasya karmana manasagira nikilashapi avastasu jivan muktasa uchyate. Its translation is, one who engages in the transcendental service of the Lord in body, mind, and word is to be considered as liberated in all conditions of material existence. That means when we engage in the transcendental service of the Lord in body, mind, and word, that is, we say manasa, vacha, karmana, in our body, in our minds, in our words, such a person is considered to be liberated in all conditions of this material existence. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, spiritual master of our founder Acharya, Srila Prabhupada, he has given a very nice quote. He says that when we open the heart for Krishna, he occupies the strategic position and gradually takes over us, just like when an army invades the entire, they enter the coastal area and then take up strategic points and gradually attack and take over. Similarly, if we give little room for Krishna, he will take strategic positions and clean all the unwanted desires in our heart. This example is that when an army invades the enemy, what they do is they enter a coastal area. And after entering the coastal area, they take up some strategic points and then gradually attack and take over the enemy. Similarly, if we give little room for Krishna for us in our life, then the Lord takes up strategic positions in our heart and then cleans all the unwanted desires that are there in our heart. That means we have a lot of unwanted desires on our heart, which needs to be cleaned. And that can be cleaned only by the process of devotional service. Devotional service is so powerful that it can free one from all the karmic reactions that we might have performed in so many lifetimes. So that is how the Lord here, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Thakur says that if we give little room for the Lord Krishna in our heart, then he takes care of our life by engaging us in devotional service. When we perform devotional service, then what happens is that we become free from the reactions of the so much of karmic activities that we have performed. Sinful, some may be offensive, some may be vikarma also against the laws. So even if some are karma, still there are reactions. So we are subject to the actions and reactions of our activities in the previous lives, so many lifetimes, and we suffer for that. But the actual soul that is situated in the heart, is free from these reactions and actions and reactions. So when we start performing devotional service, we realize that we are not this material body, but we are a spirit soul. So devotional service is like a fire, and anyone who touches himself, it burns their fingers. That means whether a rich man or a poor man, whether he's an educated or he's illiterate, the moment anyone touches the fire, it burns his fingers. Similarly, anyone who comes in contact with devotional service of the Lord becomes cleansed of all the sinful activities that one performs in his lifetimes. During Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's time, there was a devotee called Satyaraja Khan. So he asked Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, "My dear Lord, being a householder and a materialistic man, I do not know the process of advancing in spiritual life." So it's an example for this. He asked Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, "I'm a householder, and I'm also a materialistic man. How can I advance in spiritual life? I submit myself unto your lotus feet, and I request you to give me orders." So he's asking instructions from Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu replied, "Without cessation, continue chanting the name of Lord Krishna. Whenever possible, serve him and his devotees, the Vaishnavas. Simply by chanting the holy name of Krishna, one becomes free for all sinful reactions. One can complete the 9 processes of devotional service simply by chanting of the holy name." That means here Mahaprabhu replied, "You continue chanting and whenever possible, serve the devotees of the Lord, that is the Vaishnavas. And by simply chanting the holy name, one becomes free from not only all the sinful reactions, it is as good by chanting the holy name, one completes the other 8 processes. That is the totally 9 processes of devotional service. That is Shavanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dasyam, Sakyam, etc. So by one chanting of the holy name, one becomes automatically one is already perfecting the other process of devotional service. Also, chanting is the beginning stage of devotional service. And Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself set a perfect example when he was present. When the Lord was doing kirtan, continuous kirtan in the house of Advaita Acharya, at that time there was a maid servant whose name was Duki, and her duty was to go and bring water from the Ganges river, uh, and with that Ganges water, the devotees would bathe the Lord. So when the Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu saw this menial service being done by a maid servant whose name was Duki, immediately the Lord changed her name to Suki. He said she is not Duki anymore, but she is Suki. The point is that even though she was a maid servant, but because she was engaging in a menial service of bringing water to bathe the Lord, the Lord changed her name to Suki. She is not anymore distressed, but she is happy. So the point is that there is a very nice quote by Madhvacharya. I will not quote the sloka, but I'll give the translation. It says, Lord Vishnu dwells in devotional service. That means the Lord resides in devotional service. He is controlled by devotional service. Only by devotional service does he give darshana to his devotees. And only by devotional service does he award liberation to the living entities. That means, I'll repeat again, Lord Vishnu dwells in devotional service. He is controlled by devotional service. The Lord cannot be controlled because he is fully independent. But still, that Supreme Lord becomes controlled by devotional service. Then he says, only by devotional service does he give darshana to his devotees. That means when one performs devotional service of Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, etc., one can have darshana of the Supreme Lord. And only by devotional service does he award liberation to the living entities. So originally we are meant to be situated in a liberated platform, but when we start engaging in devotional service, the Lord gives liberation. And only by devotional service can we get liberated, not otherwise. And then further he says, intense affection for Lord Vishnu is called devotional service. And this devotional service is the supreme method of achieving Lord Vishnu. That means we must develop that intense affection for Lord Vishnu, and that is what is called devotional service. And devotional service is the only method of achieving Lord Vishnu. So Lord Vishnu is situated in devotional service, and the only process of achieving that Supreme Lord Krishna is nothing but devotional service. So here, that Lord who has got all these spiritual qualities, the soul is offering his prayers, glorifying the spiritual qualities of the Lord. So with this, I conclude the class for the day. The next 2 minutes, you can have, any of you have got any questions or any comments, you can ask me. Does anybody has any questions on today's subject?
Hare Krishna Prabhu, Pranam Prabhu.
Hare Krishna, Danda Pranam.
Prabhuji, wonderful class, Prabhuji, first of all. And as we are explaining the three modes of nature acts on the material body.
Yes.
So how to understand whether it acts on the senses and material body means it includes everything, right? The senses,
Yes.
everything. So
Yes.
please will you elaborate a little bit?
Okay. Let's take, for example, ear. The ear is originally, the senses of hearing is already there originally in the spiritual. But when we come to this material world, we hear so many other nonsense which contaminate. And when we come to this material world, the senses automatically get contaminated. So when we are subjected to hearing other thing other than the glories of the Lord, we identify ourselves with that. We see so many people when they get addicted to a music or addicted to hearing about, say, politics or cinema and so many things, it becomes an addiction to them. So they think that is all in all. But the reality is that originally the senses are pure and they are always situated in hearing the glories of the Lord. But when they are contaminated, they are tend to hear the other things which are not spiritual but material in nature. So we try to experience a sort of a material happiness by hearing these things, which are actually illusory in nature. For example, if somebody likes a song, a film song, when he hears this song again and again, he may hear 5 times, 10 times, 15 times, 20 times. But over a period of time, that song does not give him anymore that happiness which is required. So, which he originally thought, it is an illusory happiness. That is why it is said that we have a tendency to hear the glories of the Lord. So similarly, we would like to see the beauty of the Lord with our eyes. The Lord has given eyes to see the beauty. So that tendency is already there. But when we come to this material world, we identify with artificial beauty. We see so many, for example, when we pass by a street, we might see so many mannequins, etc., and we might get attracted by the beauty. But we don't realize that mannequin is not a real beauty. There is, it's like a doll. So, like that, we see artificially everything that is beautiful in this material nature. That is how a person becomes situated in either goodness or passion and ignorance, depending on one how he associates with. If he is associating with good people, he might be in the mode of goodness. If someone is associated with more with devotee, with people who are in the mode of passion, who are highly wanting to, I want to get this, I want to get that, we also develop that nature. And when we associate with people who are in the mode of ignorance, always drinking and sleeping, then we also get that nature. So the more we associate with materialistic people, depending on whatever mode they are in, we also become identified with that because we also get their qualities. So that is how one becomes entangled in this material world. We experience, even a person who is drunk also experiences happiness in his drinking. He does not know actually the drink is drinking him. Is it clear, Babu?
Yeah. Thank you, Prabhuji. That's clear.
Thank you, Babu. Anybody else? Any other questions, comments? If not, can I take the class as closed, Babu? Hare Krishna. I think nobody has got any questions or comments. So can I take the class as closed? Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Can I close the class, Prabhu? Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna.
Krishna Prabhu, I feel you can close Prabhuji from your end.
Okay. Okay. Can you call me in the WhatsApp? I just want to talk to you for a minute after leaving the class.